Most modern ideas about medieval craftsmen are shaped by extremes. They are often imagined either as endlessly struggling laborers or as romantic figures defined by hardship alone. What is usually missed is the structure that sat between those ideas, the routine, the discipline, and the quiet competence that allowed work to happen every day, often in small workshops built for consistency rather than spectacle. A medieval town craftsman lived by order, not by urgency, and not by improvisation, but by repetition, preparation, and an understanding that mistakes were costly long before they were dramatic. Tools mattered, materials mattered, animals mattered, and the day unfolded according to habits refined over years, rather than plans made that morning. This is not a story of exception. It is a single, ordinary day shaped by skill, routine, and the small decisions that allowed work to continue without friction. The day begins not with noise, but with order. Light reaches the workshop before sound does, slipping in through the high, narrow opening above the door and settling across the bench in a pale stripe. Dust hangs where it always does, suspended long enough to catch the light before remembering it has somewhere else to be. The town outside is already awake, but here, inside these walls, the morning arrives more deliberately. The carpenter stands still for a moment, letting his eyes move over the space. Nothing here is accidental. Tools rest where hands expect them to be. The bench carries the shallow scars of years of careful work. Cuts made by people who knew exactly where the blade would land and accepted the mark anyway. Wood shavings from yesterday have been swept aside, gathered neatly against the wall, waiting to be taken out later. A shop that begins the day untidy invites mistakes, and mistakes are expensive. He sets his hand on the bench, feeling the cool grain beneath his palm. The saw hangs where it always does, teeth clean, handle worn smooth by use rather than neglect. Nearby, chisels sit wrapped in cloth, their edges protected, not out of sentiment, but habit. Measuring sticks lean against the wall, each marked by hands that trusted them more than numbers written elsewhere. This is a place built on repetition, not surprise. Outside, the donkey shifts. You hear it before you see it, the soft scuff of hooves against packed earth, followed by a low sound that suggests patience rather than complaint. The carpenter steps to the doorway and looks out. The animal stands in the narrow yard behind the workshop, already awake, already waiting. It does not pull at its tether. It never does. Some creatures learn quickly that the day moves better when it is allowed to. He fills a small bucket and sets it down. The donkey lowers its head, drinking steadily, unbothered by the town's growing noise beyond the wall. They have worked together long enough to understand the rhythm. This morning will involve leaving. That much is clear. The carpenter returns inside and begins the quiet ritual of preparation. He checks the straps that will later hold the planks, running his fingers along the leather, testing for weakness. He selects a length of rope, coiling it carefully, setting it where it can be reached without looking. The donkey will carry the weight today. The carpenter will carry the planning. This is not unusual. Raw planks are not stored here. Space in town is too precious, and wood behaves better when it has been left to rest elsewhere. The supplier beyond the walls keeps the stock stacked neatly, seasoned just enough to behave. Today's work depends on those planks arriving in good condition, and the donkey is as much a part of that process as any tool. The carpenter steps back to the bench and runs through the day ahead. There are orders waiting, simple ones, measured ones, pieces that require accuracy more than speed. He knows where each plank will go before it arrives. He knows which cuts will be made first, which joints must be clean, which edges will never be seen but must still be true. The saw will do most of the talking later. For now, it waits. The town's sound seeps in gradually, muffled by stone and timber. A cart passes somewhere nearby. Voices rise and fall, close enough to register, far enough to ignore. The carpenter does not rush. Rushing wastes effort. The day will take what it takes. He gathers what he needs and steps back into the yard. The donkey lifts its head, ears forward, already aware of what comes next. The carpenter adjusts the simple harness, checking each strap with the same care he gives his tools. Wood can be replaced. A reliable animal cannot. The gate opens with a familiar creak. Beyond it, the town waits, and beyond that, the road leading out, where the planks are stacked and the day truly begins. The carpenter gives the donkey a final pat, not for encouragement, but acknowledgement. They step forward together. The road begins to matter as soon as the town lets go of you. Stone gives way to packed earth just beyond the gate, the surface softening underfoot, marked by ruts that remember every cart that has passed this way. The carpenter adjusts his pace without thinking. The donkey does the same. They have walked this stretch often enough to know where the ground dips and where it holds. Behind them, the town closes itself again. Sound fades first. The overlapping voices and knocks and wheels blur into something indistinct, then fall away altogether. What remains is the rhythm of walking, the steady pull of the harness, the occasional creak of leather settling into place. The road opens gently ahead, flanked by hedges that have grown wherever they were not actively discouraged. The donkey walks with an unhurried certainty. It keeps to the middle of the path, where the ground is firmest, ears moving independently, tracking sounds that do not concern the carpenter. A bird lifts suddenly from the hedge, wings beating sharply before disappearing again. The donkey pauses for half a breath, then continues. Having decided the matter is already over, the carpenter glances ahead, measuring distance by habit rather than thought. This supplier sits just far enough beyond the town to make the walk worthwhile, close enough to reach without complaint, far enough to justify the space needed for stacks of wood. Planks behave better when they are given room, when air can move around them, when moisture has somewhere to go. The carpenter approves of this arrangement. The road narrows slightly where it curves here. The earth has been pressed hard by repeated use, smooth in places, uneven in others. The carpenter steps around a shallow puddle left from the night, boots finding the familiar edge where the ground holds. The donkey follows without instruction, hooves placing themselves carefully, weight shifting with quiet intelligence. They pass another traveler heading toward town, a man with a bundle slung over his shoulder. There is a nod, nothing more. Out here, conversation would only slow the day. Each continues on, satisfied with the exchange. The smell of wood arrives before the stacks do. It rides the air lightly at first, dry and clean, carrying with it the suggestion of order. As they draw closer, the scent thickens, joined by the faint tang of sap and the deeper note of timber that has been cut, rested, and cut again. The carpenter slows slightly, already assessing quality by instinct. The supplier's yard sits back from the road, bordered by a low fence that serves more as a reminder than a barrier. inside. Planks are stacked in careful rows, lifted off the ground on stone blocks to keep them dry. Each stack is marked by size and age, the older wood kept separate, reserved for work that demands patience. This is not a place for guessing. The carpenter greets the supplier. Briefly, words are exchanged that confirm what both already know. Which planks are needed, which stacks to avoid. There is no haggling worth mentioning. Good wood is worth what it costs, and poor wood announces itself quickly. The carpenter moves among the stacks, hand brushing along the surface of a plank, fingers tracing the grain. He selects pieces with care, choosing boards that are straight without being stubborn, seasoned enough to behave, but not so old that they resist shaping. Each plank is lifted, tested for weight, balance, and sound, then set aside. The donkey watches with mild interest, ears flicking as wood is shifted nearby. Loading begins slowly. The carpenter arranges the planks across the donkey's back, distributing the weight evenly, adjusting until the load settles comfortably. Straps are tightened, then checked again. The donkey stands patiently, shifting once, then finding its balance. It knows this part of the work well. When the last plank is secured, the carpenter steps back and looks. The load is neat. Nothing overhangs unnecessarily. The rope lies flat. No twists, no strain where it does not belong. Satisfied, he gives the donkey a light pat and turns back toward the road. The return begins without ceremony. The donkey steps forward, weight carried easily, pace unchanged. The carpenter follows, glancing once more at the yard, already thinking ahead to the cuts these planks will become. The road stretches back toward the town, unchanged, waiting to be walked again. As they move on, the town rises slowly in the distance, its walls catching the light. The carpenter settles into the rhythm of the return, the steady movement of feet and hooves, the quiet understanding that the day is still unfolding. The planks ride securely behind him, promising work, not trouble. For now, everything is as it should be. The town receives them without comment. Passing back through the gate feels different than leaving. The road's soft earth gives way again to stone, and sound returns in layers. Footsteps, voices, the distant knock of work already underway. The donkey's hooves strike the ground with a steadier rhythm now, the load settled firmly across its back. People step aside easily, accustomed to making room for both animal and purpose. The carpenter turns down the familiar lane toward his workshop. The town looks unchanged, but it never is. Doors stand open that were closed earlier. A cart rests where it had not been before. Somewhere close, a hammer finds its mark, each strike measured and confident. The carpenter keeps his pace, eyes forward, already moving the day along in his mind. At the workshop, the gate opens, then closes again behind them. The donkey is led into the yard and unburdened with practiced efficiency. Straps loosened, rope uncoiled, planks lifted down one by one and stacked carefully against the wall where they will not warp. Each board is leaned at a slight angle, air allowed to move between them. The carpenter pauses briefly, hand resting on the top plank, feeling its weight, its promise. The donkey is freed of its load and given water. It drinks deeply, then stands quietly, satisfied. Its work for the morning is finished. The carpenter pats its neck once, then turns back to the workshop. The day has reached the part that matters most. Inside, the light has shifted. The sun has climbed just enough to reach farther into the room, illuminating the bench fully now. Dust motes drift lazily through the beam. The carpenter sets the first plank across the supports, aligning it by eye before making any mark. He measures once, then again. Trusting the second more than the first, the saw is taken down from its place. Its handle fits his hand, as it always does. He sets the blade to the wood and begins the first cut, drawing it back smoothly, then pushing forward, letting the teeth do their work. The sound is familiar, a steady rasp that belongs here. On the third stroke, the sound changes. It is slight, almost nothing, a hesitation where there should not be one. The carpenter stops at once. He draws the saw back slowly and looks down the line of teeth. One catches the light differently. A tooth is gone, snapped clean, leaving a small, undeniable gap. He does not swear. He does not hurry. He simply stands, saw held lightly in his hand, considering what has happened. A broken tooth is not dramatic. It is not rare. It is inconvenient in a way that cannot be ignored. He runs a thumb carefully along the edge, not touching the teeth, just close enough to confirm what he already knows. The saw will still cut, but not cleanly. The line will wander. The wood will resist. Precision will suffer. The carpenter sets the saw down. For a moment, nothing moves. Outside, the donkey shifts its weight. Somewhere beyond the wall, the town continues its work, unaware of the pause. Inside, the carpenter weighs his options without anxiety. He could force the cut. That would be faster, and it would show in the work. He could set this plank aside and choose another. That would delay everything else. Or he could adjust, change the order of tasks. Work where the saw is not yet required. He chooses the third. The plank is moved aside carefully. Another is brought forward, one that requires planing first. The plane is lifted, its iron checked, then set to the wood. Long strokes follow, steady and controlled. Shavings curl away, gathering at his feet. The workshop regains its rhythm, altered but intact. The broken saw waits. It rests on the bench, visible but not urgent. The carpenter knows it will need attention before the day is done. Filing the teeth will take time. Replacing the blade will take longer. Neither option is impossible. Neither needs to be solved immediately. He works on adapting without comment. The donkey settles fully now, lowering itself into the shade. The town outside grows louder, then steadies. Inside, the carpenter shapes the wood patiently, letting the day bend rather than break. The sound that did not belong has been acknowledged. The work continues. The workshop settles into a different rhythm. Nothing has been fixed yet, but nothing is wrong enough to stop. The carpenter knows this feeling well. It is the space between recognition and resolution, where skill matters more than speed, and patience does most of the heavy lifting. He keeps the saw where it can be seen, not because it needs watching, but because pretending it is not there would invite carelessness. A damaged tool has a way of reminding you of itself at the wrong moment. Better to let it sit openly, acknowledged, waiting its turn. The plane continues its work. Long, even strokes draw thin curls of wood away from the plank, each one landing softly among the others at his feet. The surface beneath the blade smooths gradually, grain emerging clean and obedient. This is familiar work, slower than sawing, but forgiving. The carpenter adjusts his stance, shifting weight, letting the motion carry through his shoulders rather than his arms. Outside, the donkey breathes deeply and does not move. Inside, the air grows warmer as effort replaces motion. The carpenter pauses to brush shavings aside, clearing the space around his boots. He checks the plank again, running his hand across the surface, feeling for imperfections his eyes might miss. Satisfied, he sets it aside and brings another forward. There is a small rearrangement of the day happening here. Tasks that require the saw are postponed. Tasks that do not are brought forward. The order shifts quietly, without complaint. This is not improvisation. It is routine flexibility, learned over years of days that did not go exactly as planned. He reaches for a chisel and unwraps it carefully. The edge catches the light, sharp and clean. Mortise work will occupy the next stretch of time, joints that demand attention but not the saw. He marks the wood lightly, measures twice, then begins. The chisel enters the grain with controlled pressure, each cut deliberate, each chip removed with intention. The sound is different now. Instead of the rasp of teeth through wood, there is the dull tap of mallet against handle, the quiet crack as fibers give way. The workshop feels calmer for it, as though it has agreed to slow down in sympathy. The broken saw remains untouched. The carpenter glances at it occasionally, not with frustration, but calculation. Filing the teeth would restore function well enough for the day. A replacement blade would be better, but that requires a visit across town and a conversation he is not ready to have yet. The decision can wait until the work in front of him is finished. He works through the morning steadily. Planks are shaped, edges trued, joints cut cleanly. Each piece is checked, then checked again. Where the saw would have sped the process, the carpenter compensates with care. The work does not suffer. It simply takes the time it needs. Outside, sound drifts in and out. Footsteps pass the workshop. A voice rises briefly, then fades. The town continues without concern for the order of tasks inside this room. That is, as it should be. A craftsman's work does not require an audience. The donkey stirs once, then settles again. The carpenter straightens slowly, rolling his shoulders to ease the quiet ache that has settled there. He drinks from a small cup, then sets it aside. The bench waits patiently. So does the saw. Eventually, he picks it up, not to use it, but to examine it again. He tilts the blade toward the light, inspecting the teeth one by one. The missing tooth is obvious, a small interruption in an otherwise reliable line. He runs a cloth along the blade, wiping away dust, then sets it back down. Not yet. The day is not finished, and neither is the work that does not require it. He returns to the bench, selecting another plank, marking it carefully. The plane comes back into his hands. The rhythm resumes. The workshop hums quietly with effort. Nothing here is wasted, not time, not motion, not even the pause created by a broken tool. The carpenter moves around the problem the way water moves around stone, without argument, without hurry. When the time comes to address the saw, he will. Until then, the work continues. Altered but intact, shaped by skill rather than urgency. By the time the light shifts again, the town has settled into itself. The carpenter notices it not by looking out, but by listening. The sounds beyond the workshop door have changed shape. They are steadier now, less layered, each one taking its turn. Carts roll past at regular intervals. Voices rise briefly, then drop. Somewhere close, a hammer keeps time with the hour. Not fast, not slow, just persistent. Inside, the work continues. The bench is occupied by pieces in various stages of completion, each one paused exactly where it should be. The carpenter moves between them with ease, selecting what needs attention next, setting aside what can wait. The broken saw remains where it was left, visible but no longer, demanding consideration. This is the part of the day where routine proves its worth. The carpenter reaches for a marking tool and measures again, confirming dimensions he already trusts. He does not rush. The town will not reward speed, only reliability. Orders will still be there, whether he finishes now or in an hour. The work must be right. That is the only urgency that matters. Outside, the donkey lifts its head as someone passes the gate. It watches for a moment, ears forward, then lowers its head again. Its role today is finished, and it accepts that without protest. The shade has shifted slightly, and it adjusts its position with the careful economy of an animal that understands comfort as a practical concern. The carpenter steps back from the bench and studies. The pieces laid out, they form a quiet sequence, each one dependent on the next. He rearranges them slightly, bringing forward a task that requires careful fitting rather than cutting. A joint is tested, eased, then tested again. A corner is adjusted with a few precise strokes of the chisel. The wood responds predictably, rewarded by patience. The town presses in gently. A voice calls out nearby, asking a question that does not require an answer from here. Footsteps pause just outside the workshop, then move on. Someone laughs briefly, the sound cut short, as though remembered too late. None of it demands attention. All of it confirms that the day is progressing as expected. The carpenter wipes his hands on a cloth and drinks again. The water is cool, unremarkable, exactly what it should be. He sets the cup aside and returns to the bench, posture settling into the familiar angle that allows work to continue without strain. The plane comes back into use, its iron humming softly as it skims the surface of a plank. Shavings gather again at his feet. They will be swept later. For now, they mark progress. Each curl represents effort spent well, motion that did not need correction. The broken saw waits patiently, no longer a problem, just a task that has not yet been scheduled. The carpenter considers the afternoon ahead. There will be time to address the saw before the day ends. Either the teeth will be filed or the blade will be replaced. The decision does not press. Both paths are familiar. Neither threatens the work already done. He continues shaping, fitting, testing. The town's sound drifts and settles around the workshop like a tide that knows its limits. Nothing intrudes. Nothing demands urgency. The carpenter works within this steady frame, confident that the structure of the day will hold. Outside, the donkey shifts once more, then rests. Inside, the wood yields to practiced hands. The disruption that briefly interrupted the morning has been absorbed into the rhythm of the day, its edges smoothed by routine. The town does not wait, and it does not need to. The work is being done. There comes a moment when work pauses, not because it must, but because it should. The carpenter recognizes it without checking the light or listening for a cue from outside. his hands slow. The sequence of tasks he has been following reaches a natural break. What remains cannot be done properly without the saw, and pretending otherwise would only create more work later. He turns his attention to the bench where the tool rests. The saw lies exactly where he left it, blade clean, handle turned slightly outward, as if ready to be taken up again. He lifts it carefully, not out of reverence, but habit. A good tool is not precious, it is dependable, and dependence requires maintenance. He sets it flat and examines the teeth once more. The missing tooth is easy to spot. It interrupts the line cleanly, a small gap that would guide the blade off course if ignored. The carpenter nods slightly, as though acknowledging an old acquaintance who has finally spoken up. From a shelf beneath the bench, he takes a narrow file. It is wrapped in cloth, its surface protected from dust and careless handling. He unwraps it slowly, checks its edge, then settles himself in a position that allows both hands to work without strain. This is not a task to rush. Filing a saw demands patience more than strength. He begins. Each stroke of the file is deliberate, angled just so, restoring the shape of the tooth one careful pass at a time. The sound is faint, a soft rasp that barely rises above the ambient noise of the workshop. He works methodically along the blade, adjusting neighboring teeth to match, ensuring the line is true. Time stretches comfortably. Outside, the town continues without reference to this small act of correction. A cart passes, someone calls out. The donkey shifts its weight, then settles again. Inside, the carpenter keeps his focus narrow, attention held by the small, precise movements of his hands. He pauses often, not from fatigue, but to inspect his progress. He holds the blade up to the light, sighting along the edge, checking for consistency. When he is satisfied, he resumes, making another pass, refining rather than forcing the result. Eventually, he sets the file aside. The saw is tested lightly against a scrap of wood, just enough to confirm the teeth engage evenly. The blade moves smoothly, the sound returned to its familiar, even rasp. The interruption has been corrected. The tool is honest again. He cleans the blade carefully and returns it to its place. There is no sense of triumph. This was expected work, done because it needed doing. Tools fail. Craftsmen respond. The day continues. The carpenter returns to the bench and brings forward the plank he set aside earlier. He marks the cut again, aligns the saw, and begins. This time, the blade moves as it should, straight and obedient, the wood yielding without resistance. The cut progresses cleanly, the line holding true. The work resumes its earlier rhythm. Outside, the light has shifted once more, softening at the edges. The town's sound thins slightly as afternoon deepens. Inside, the carpenter completes the cut, sets the piece aside, and reaches for the next. The donkey remains at rest. The workshop hums quietly with renewed purpose. The disruption that shaped the day has been absorbed, resolved, and left behind without ceremony. The carpenter works on, confident that the tools at hand will do what they are meant to do, as long as they are given the care they require. The afternoon stretches ahead, unremarkable and productive. With the saw restored, the workshop regains its earlier confidence. The carpenter moves through the remaining tasks without hesitation, the sequence of work re-establishing itself naturally. Pieces are brought forward, fitted, and set aside in an order that feels less like planning and more like memory. The day no longer requires adjustment. It proceeds on familiar terms. Light enters the workshop at a lower angle now. It stretches across the bench, catching the edges of tools and the pale surfaces of newly worked wood. Dust drifts lazily through the air, no longer stirred by quick movement. The carpenter adjusts his stance to accommodate the change, shifting his work slightly so the light falls where it is most useful. The saw speaks steadily again. Each cut is measured, controlled, and clean. The sound is reassuring in its regularity, neither hurried nor tentative. Where earlier the work had required consideration, now it flows. The carpenter, trusting the tools to behave as expected. He pauses occasionally to check his progress. Edges are tested with the pad of his thumb. Joints are fitted and refitted until they seat without persuasion. Nothing is forced. Wood responds best when it is allowed to do so at its own pace. Outside, the town begins to loosen. Footsteps pass less frequently. Voices soften. The clatter of work gives way to quieter sounds. Doors closing. Carts being guided toward storage. The low murmur of conversations that do not need to travel far. The carpenter hears it all without listening. The donkey lifts its head briefly as someone passes the gate, then lowers it again. The yard is shaded now, the heat of the day receding. The donkey stretches one leg, then another, settling more comfortably into the dirt. Its work was finished hours ago, and it carries no concern for what remains inside the workshop. The carpenter sets aside the final piece for the day. He aligns it carefully, makes one last cut, and smooths the edge with a few controlled strokes of the plane. The piece is set alongside the others, its place in the sequence complete. There is satisfaction here, but it is quiet, the kind that does not demand acknowledgement. He cleans the bench slowly. Shavings are gathered and set aside. Tools are wiped and returned to their places. The saw is hung carefully, its blade catching the light one last time before the workshop begins to dim. The rhythm of the town continues its gentle descent. Outside, the sky shifts toward softer colors. Shadows lengthen along the lane. The carpenter closes the shutters part way, not to darken the room entirely, but to signal that the day's work is drawing to a close. He steps into the yard. The donkey looks up, ears forward, recognizing the change in routine. The carpenter checks the tether, then sets out a small measure of feed. The animal eats steadily, unhurried, content with the simple reward. The carpenter stands for a moment, hands resting at his sides. The work has been done. The tools are in order. The day has moved as it should. There is nothing more to add to it. As the light continues to soften, the workshop settles into stillness, holding the shapes of the day's labor within its walls. The end of the working day arrives quietly. There is no signal for it, beyond the carpenter's own sense that the tools have had enough for now. The light no longer falls where it is useful, and the air inside the workshop has cooled just enough to remind him that evening has begun its slow approach. He moves through the familiar closing ritual without hurry. The bench is cleared completely this time, not just tidied. Each tool is checked before being put away, edges wiped clean, handles freed of dust and resin. The plane is returned to its shelf. The chisels are wrapped once more in their cloth. The saw hangs where it belongs, its place reclaimed without comment. These small acts matter. They ensure that tomorrow will begin without resistance, that no effort will be wasted rediscovering order. The carpenter performs them with the same care he gives the work itself, understanding that the day is not finished until the space is ready to receive another. Outside, the town's sound thins further. Carts are guided into storage. Voices become fewer, softer. The rhythm that carried the day loosens, allowing gaps of quiet to settle in between remaining noises. The carpenter closes the shutters, fully now, letting the workshop dim into shadow. He steps out into the yard. The donkey stands calmly, having finished its feed, ears flicking once as the carpenter approaches. The animal is untethered and guided a few steps farther back, where the ground is softer and the wall breaks the evening breeze. The carpenter checks the straps, then leaves them loosened for the night. The yard feels smaller in the evening. Shadows gather at the edges, corners softening into indistinct shapes. The carpenter takes a moment to look over the space, ensuring everything is as it should be. Nothing needs adjusting. Nothing calls for attention. He closes the gate. The sound is final but gentle, wood settling into place rather than snapping shut. The workshop is secure. The tools are at rest. The day's labor remains behind the walls, held safely until morning. The carpenter moves toward the house adjoining the workshop. Inside, the air is warmer, carrying the familiar scent of fire and cooked grain. The transition is immediate and comforting. Where the workshop held the effort of the day, this space gathers what remains of it and allows it to disperse. He washes his hands carefully. Water runs over skin marked by work, carrying away dust and the fine traces of resin. He dries them slowly, aware of the quiet ache in his shoulders, the steady tiredness that comes from hours spent standing and shaping. It is not unpleasant, it is earned. The evening meal is simple. He eats without haste, savoring warmth more than flavor. Outside, the last light fades from the lane, replaced by the muted glow of firelight behind shutters. The town settles further, each household drawing inward. The carpenter sits for a moment longer. There is no need to fill the time. The day has already done that. He listens briefly to the remaining sounds outside, footsteps passing once, a voice calling softly, then nothing. The evening holds. The workshop remains closed, quiet, and prepared. The donkey shifts once in the yard, then becomes still. The carpenter rises, knowing there is nothing left to do but rest. The day ends, not with a moment, but with a gradual easing, the weight of effort loosening its hold. Not all at once, and not evenly, but inevitably. The carpenter notices it first, in the way sound behaves. What little remains does not travel far. A footstep here, a brief murmur there, each one absorbed quickly, leaving space behind inside the house. The fire has been reduced to embers. It gives off a steady warmth without insistence, enough to hold the room together. The carpenter sits nearby, letting the heat reach his hands and shoulders. The effort of the day lingers in his muscles, not as pain, but as weight slowly being set down. Outside, the donkey shifts and settles. The sound is faint, familiar, a reassurance rather than an interruption. The animal has found a position that will do for the night. Nothing more is expected of it. The carpenter listens. Without listening, the town continues its quiet unwinding beyond the walls. Somewhere a door closes, careful not to disturb. Another opens briefly, then shuts again. The sounds do not overlap anymore. They occur one at a time, as though the town has agreed to speak politely until morning. He moves through the house slowly. There is no reason to rush now. The spaces are small, but they hold what is needed. A bench, a table, a corner claimed by rest. Everything arranged for function rather than comfort, though comfort arrives anyway. Earned by familiarity. He pauses near the doorway that leads back to the workshop. The tools are beyond it, already at rest, arranged and waiting. The work of the day remains complete, untouched by the night. There is nothing unfinished that needs attention. Tomorrow will begin where today ended, and that is enough. The carpenter returns to the fire and sits again. The embers shift quietly, settling into themselves. The light they cast is low and steady, barely reaching the edges of the room. Shadows hold still now, no longer shaped by movement. Outside, the lane is dark. The last of the day's warmth has left the stones, and the air carries a slight chill. The town does not resist it. Windows glow faintly, one by one, then dim as lamps are turned down or extinguished. The town folds inward, each household gathering what remains of the day and keeping it close. The carpenter stretches once, carefully. It is a simple movement, practiced and sufficient. He stands, prepares the space for sleep without ceremony, and lowers himself down where rest waits. The surface beneath him is firm but familiar, shaped by repeated use. Blankets are adjusted. The day's clothing is set aside neatly. The fire is allowed to burn low. There is no need to tend it further. It will hold through the night. The carpenter lies still, breathing evenly, letting the quiet settle fully. Outside, the donkey breathes in the darkness. The town holds its shape, walls and roofs doing their quiet work. Nothing presses. Nothing demands attention. The day has been released. The night takes over gently. Nothing changes suddenly. The carpenter lies still, breath settling into an even rhythm that no longer needs attention. The warmth of the room remains steady and unremarkable, doing its work quietly. The fire has reduced itself to a faint glow, embers holding just enough heat to keep the night from pressing too close. Outside, the town has gone almost entirely quiet. What sound remains arrives rarely and leaves quickly. A distant shift of wood, the soft call of an animal somewhere beyond the walls. Each one fades before it has time to form a thought. The workshop rests, tools remain where they were left. Edges clean, surfaces prepared for another morning. The saw hangs in its place, corrected and waiting, its interruption already forgotten. The bench holds the shapes of the day's work without asking for anything more. The donkey sleeps in the yard. Its breathing is slow and deep, the harness slack, the ground beneath it cool and familiar. It does not stir. The night offers nothing that requires response. The town holds together in this state. Walls lean inward, roofs settle, lanes empty themselves of movement. Light has withdrawn behind shutters, leaving only darkness and the memory of heat. The structures that shaped the day now keep it contained, allowing rest to settle where effort once lived. Inside the house, nothing moves. The carpenter's hands rest where they fell. Muscles soften. The careful tension that guided the day loosens its grip. There is no need to review what has been done. The work is complete, and the night accepts that without question. Time slows, not in a way that can be measured, but in a way that can be felt. Moments stretch, then dissolve. The town breathes as one, a collection of small, steady rhythms aligned by rest. The fire dims further, its light retreats into itself, leaving only the faintest suggestion of warmth. Shadows merge into stillness. The room becomes a single, quiet space, holding nothing but the presence of sleep. Outside, the air cools. Stone releases the last of the day's warmth. The ground settles. The town remains unchanged, protected by habit and repetition, waiting patiently for morning to arrive when it is ready. Nothing more is required. The night keeps watch. The town sleeps.